hot shots coming from, from the church in Liberia. So I'm truly honored and really grateful to AFJN for convening this session. So I guess, you know, I'm a Liberian who spends a lot of time in the US, and so I obsess about old sides. And so I guess I wanted to start off first of all by saying that there's some unique things about Liberia that I think is important to keep in mind in this conversation. First, in terms of governance and democracy, Liberia is kind of the only country on the continent that had, from the start of its founding to early 1900s, constant change of government. So the first few governments in Liberia, from 1847 till about 1920, there was a change from one party to the next. I'd like to think that came to an end. If you look at the historians, Carl Patrick Burroughs and others, you know, it's actually pretty clear. In the 1920s, when Firestone Tire and Rubber came to Liberia and started the world's largest rubber operations, things started to change. From 1926, when Firestone was established, I would say till today, what Liberia has experienced is a situation where particular interests of foreign national corporations, multinational corporations, in Liberia's resources have dominated the political decision-making, have dominated the economic scene, have actually squeezed out the space for Liberians to determine their own future. So what you have 8+ decades after Firestone, and my Liberian colleagues think I'm obsessed about Firestone, and maybe it's true, but it's such a dominant part of our history, of our politics, and of our economy. We cannot talk about governance without talking about the role of multinational corporations in Liberia. Why? Because Liberia was blessed by God with these incredible resources. You throw anything down and it grows, right? All of you have been there, the mangoes, the plums we call them, right? The pineapples, sweetest in the world, the cashews, right? But you also have timber that was a source of unfortunately volatility throughout the war. Timber that is also now a source of one of the last remaining kind of spaces for the planet to breathe that's now being cut and destroyed, right? Liberia also is a long sea coast along the Atlantic. We could have fisheries that would be thriving. We have had historic issues that have prevented that from happening. Decisions being made often not by Liberians, but by those outside of Liberia, pioneering to that. We have now new discoveries of oil, right? I mean, long talked about, and yet no sense of you know, what is actually happening being made transparent to the Liberian people. So what you see are vital resources that could actually drive a new economy for Liberia, could drive a much more open and democratic political process, and yet there's no transparency. There's no even dialogue. And I think we have to fault both the government and civil society, and maybe even the press, right? Because we've got to understand these fundamental issues that are not only vital for Liberians, but for the survival of the planet in an age of climate change. So I think we've got to begin a conversation about governance really by calling it as it is. The majority of the people have not, and actually have never, had a proper say in the governance of their country. So what you saw in this last election was actually historic, because young people basically said, we're the majority, and we may have had an educated class that has led the government over the last 12 years, but they have let us down. They have been involved in corrupt practices, they have been involved in nepotism, they have been involved in outright theft of government resources. And young people have said, okay, enough is enough. Let's try a different way. So overwhelmingly, throughout the country, all counties except one voted for this government. All counties except one, which is the county that the former vice president came from. Right? That was the only county that he won. The rest, overwhelming support to the soccer star. right? So Liberia is historic because we're the only country on the continent and on the continent that has had the first democratically elected woman president, and then the first democratically elected soccer star on the continent. We're like the history, right? But I think we've got to understand that support to a very popular soccer star. Let's remember, he is the only African who won World Player of the Year. The only African player ever to win World Player of the Year. All right, you all, okay. You may not all be sports fans, but that's a big deal, right? For young people, for Africans. And still today, when, as I travel, I just came back from Tanzania, people, first thing they say, George Weah, Player of the Year. That's how people connect with him and now with the country. And I frankly have to say, yes, I prefer being connected with the Player of the Year than with the abusers of Charles Taylor, which is kind of how people would call out Liberia in previous instances, right? So you had tremendous support because young people in particular are the leading demographic and are clamoring for change. Mostly because they recognize that even those who have had opportunities for education don't have jobs. And there are incredible young people who are starting to create jobs. The informal sector is thriving. But as James so perfectly said, the unemployment rate and the statistics go back to like 2014. So who knows if they're actually still accurate? The statistics still used. It's about 80% in the formal sector. So where do those young people get jobs? How do they begin to see a future for themselves? I think right now there's a window that's open for this new government. And so what you hear is the new government putting out language of pro-poor. But what you see is more of the same. What you see is still a sort of a disregard for the Liberian basic sovereignty, especially in extractive industries, in those natural resources. The economies very much still focus on natural resource extraction. And you still have companies coming, making decisions, taking what they want, no proper records. So there are two key elements. There's a concession agreement that monitors how much of a resource a company can take out. And then there's a collective bargaining agreement that manages the labor practices. And I would say on both of those instances, Liberians have really gotten the short end of the stick. The government has talked about examining these concession agreements. Haven't really seen very much. Right? And essentially, government after government, since the country, since 1926 till today, let's say, has talked about adding value to Liberia's resources, i.e. manufacturing. Maybe it's one of the few things that I would say the Trump administration people would say, they want manufacturing in America first, right? I would say we need manufacturing in Africa first. Manufacturing is where you add value to jobs. It's where you add value to resources. We have the largest rubber operations in the world. We still do not produce one set of rubber slippers or, condoms to protect people's lives or anything in Liberia. The rubber is still put on a ship and sent to America. To this day, 8 decades later, even though it's now a Japanese parent company, Bridgestone, and all of that, the same process continues. The Liberian government is not even adequately counting. It's the company that's actually counting how much rubber that they're taking out and extracting. Right? So if you do not have the fundamentals in place for an economy to be pro-poor, you cannot move beyond the rhetoric of pro-poor. That is the problem. And what you see now is a government that is now, it's almost like this vicious cycle. I know many of you in this room worked on debt cancellation because it was a pillar of the church back in 2000. Many of us as Liberians, we weighed in full speed ahead, especially at the end of the conflict, because we said this is our opportunity to get rid of, at that time, $4 billion of debt that was being paid by the Liberian people to the World Bank, to the IMF, right? Money that was not going into schools, not going into hospitals or healthcare or productive forces, but was actually circling out of the country. And what we see now is that that cycle hasn't ended. We're still on that spiral, and it is an even steeper slope. So we can talk pro-poor, but we're really on a path to continue business as usual, where those that have continue to get more. And in Liberia is a handful of families, let's be clear, that have continued to be in the haves consistently. So I was there in March, and you could see, and it's like at every turn, a hotel going up, a restaurant there, an apartment building. It's like, where is the money coming from? When you see those in the street who had such hope during the election for a change being pushed further and further to the brink. I think the other concern that I have, with the difference between the rhetoric of pro-poor or pro-people and the reality is that Liberia is also on a path to just kind of continue business as usual in terms of a militarized relationship with the U.S. And I think we've got to be really clear that this has gone from government to government for decades, right? It's not only this government, it's not only the previous government, but one of the clearest examples was during the Ebola time, which impacted every single Liberian family, right? During that time when people's lives were at risk, it was the U.S. Department of Defense calling the shots for what happened, not the Liberian Ministry of Health, right? Not even the Liberian Defense Department, Ministry of Defense, to be quite frank, right? It was the U.S. military. And what we have now in place, this Trump administration, let's be clear, is a government that is full of deal makers. They're trying to extract resources from Africa, as we heard directly from the president in September at the UN, when he said, my friends are in Africa getting rich. There's a lot in Liberia people can get rich out. There's diamond, there's gold, right? There's oil. There's a lot. The deal makers will be happy. But what the deal makers are doing is they're bringing the military with them, right? So we have to recognize that the relationships that were being pushed during the Ebola time for the U.S. military to establish a close inner working relationship with the Liberian military, that is reaping benefits for the haves at the expense of the have-nots. So we have to say, as people of conscience, as people of faith, we cannot do this under our watch. And I, for one, I was saying, I go to St. Augustine's Church, and I also, Father Hayden, I feel like he made it possible for me to be here because he gave a scholarship to my uncle, and then my uncle helped my mom to come, and then I was able to come. I am a benefit of people of conscience doing that. I believe now we've got a Pope that is setting the mark so high. Think about the planet, think about people, think about climate change, think about justice. There couldn't be a clearer time for people who have the faith traditions that we believe in, who have, quite frankly, faith across traditions, to come together to say enough is enough, to demand a different way, to say, look, we have a window where there's such goodwill, especially young people supporting a government. Use that in the best interest of the people. Understand the power that a government should have to put its people's interests first. Don't give it away to the deal makers in Washington or Beijing or wherever they may be. Turkey, in the case of Liberia, Turkey is ramping up as well, its visibility. Right? It's not just China and the US, there are other players as well. But don't just give up and say, okay, do what you want. Demand that the interests of the people is heard and respected. And I feel like forgot to ask you how long I can talk. There's so much to talk, but I wanted to say there are certain sort of low-hanging fruit. I think one of them is around education in Liberia, which we all know is at such a critical moment with all these young people needing to think about their future. Liberia used to educate and did educate the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. They had Liberian passports, they went to school in Liberia. They, you know, those who ushered in freedom in South Africa were educated in Liberia. By a Liberian education system that educated me when I was small and many of us, right? But now we have the education system change of government, but that system is still at risk. Why? Because the same World Bank has decided that the way to have an education system that functions is to privatize. So that $1 billion that's coming from the World Bank, how much of it is actually going towards consultants, towards a privatized education system that actually is hedge funds? It's called Bridges International, which is a hedge fund company from the US that is getting money from, money that is supposedly for the Liberian people, but is actually going into their coffers here in the US and elsewhere, these hedge fund companies, while they're supposedly running a privatized school system in Liberia. So the Liberian people will be paying back that debt, the $1 billion, for generations to come, but yet are not seeing any benefit because the privatized school system, and again, maybe it's the previous government that basically, many say through corrupt practices, signed deals to privatize the Liberian school system, almost writ large, until people pressure stopped. And it still went forward, but in a smaller scale, but it still went forward. Is it 500 schools, or I forgot the number at this point of schools, but it's a number that will continue to increase of privatized schools under this Bridges Academy that had actually been thrown out of Kenya, been thrown out of Uganda, and yet they're thriving in Liberia because they have the funding from the World Bank. So I think we've got to say there's low-hanging fruit. If this government is serious, that they've got to take action on now. Right? And that people of conscience have to step up, raise their voice, use their pulpits, speak out. There couldn't be a better time. I'm so thrilled that Africa Faith and Justice Network is engaging faith leaders to say, you are our hope. Find your voice, use that voice to demand the future that the world needs. So I guess it's hard to say in closing because there's so much, but I think right now Liberia is facing some very serious physical concerns with climate change. There are stretches of communities that have just disappeared below the sea already. Right? I think this is one of the areas that the government could play a role in. This is one of the areas that the church could play a role in, to say, what is happening to those communities? They were already, the West Point, already, the have-nots. Now their homes are gone because they're under the water. And I was there in March, you see, it's like, it's encroaching even further and further at every stage, and it's rainy season now, right? So we've got to understand that there's a push factor that's forcing young people to leave the country and seek other means. Some of them are going through the desert, risking their lives. Some of them are trying to come here with Mr. Trump doing all that he's doing, anti-immigrant as he is, right? So we've got to figure out how we help to build healthy economies on both sides of the Atlantic. I think there's a critical role for people of conscience to play both in Africa as well as here in the US in terms of who you vote for and also how you reach out to members of Congress. So I guess in the end, I kind of hold up what many feel is a radical faith tradition that speaks for the poor, that seeks out ways to bring health to those who are in need, that educates those.
We have a different pro-poor.
We have that. It's a radical pro-poor agenda, right? Let's make that happen, and let's see how we work together on both sides of the Atlantic, because I do think that there's a lot of people power that has made the difference around the world, that can make the difference now. And I thank you for creating a space for us to come together and learn from each other.